Welcome to the Meal Pattern and Nutrition Documentation training. This Meal Pattern and Nutrition Documentation training will include information on these topics: the final rule meal pattern updates, meal pattern terminology, the breakfast meal pattern, the lunch meal pattern, CACFP preschool meal pattern, smart snacks, after-school snack program, and nutrition-related record-keeping information. The FNS has made an update to the final rule for added sugars. Sugars that are added during the processing of foods such as table sugar, sugars from syrups and honey, and sugars from concentrated fruits or vegetable juices are referred to as added sugars. This does not include naturally occurring sugars that are found in milk, fruits, and vegetables. Phase 1, beginning July 1st, 2025, sets product-based limits to be implemented by school year 2025-2026. Breakfast cereals may have no more than 6 grams of added sugars per dry ounce. Yogurt may have no more than 12 grams of added sugars per 6 ounces. Flavored milk may have no more than 10 grams of added sugar per 8 fluid ounces. Phase 2, beginning July 1st, 2027, sets weekly dietary limits to be implemented by school year 27-28. Added sugars are limited to less than 10% of the calories across the total week's calories in the school lunch and breakfast programs. So these photos show us where to find the added sugar amount, which is just going to be under the nutrition facts label under sugars. So if you look to the picture on the left, Cinnamon Toast Crunch cereal, we see that one bowl is 28 grams, which is 1 dry ounce. In highlighted, you see that there are 6 grams of sugar, so that currently meets the requirements for school year 25-26, whereas Golden Graham cereal is not going to meet that requirement for 25-26. FNS has also made an update to the final rule regarding sodium. Sodium limits apply to the average amount of sodium in lunch and breakfast menus offered during a school week. So current sodium limits will remain in place until July 30th, 2027. Beginning July 1st, 2027 for the 27-28 school year, SFAs must implement an approximate 15% reduction for lunch and an approximate 10% reduction for breakfast from the current limits. Gradual reduction in sodium at lunch and breakfast is recommended prior to the implementation deadline by adjusting food preparation methods and purchasing lower sodium foods gradually. Let's go over a couple terms that are useful when referencing the meal patterns. The first term is components. You can think of components as food groups, since you can see here our list of components are very much like the food groups you are familiar with. In the school meals world, they're slightly different than the ones we find on the My Plate chart. We still have the fruit group, vegetable group, and grain group, but protein and dairy are defined a little differently in the meal pattern. Instead of the traditional protein group, we have the MMAs, or meat alternate group. The difference between the traditional protein group and the MMAs is that in addition to all of the foods traditionally found in the protein group like chicken, beef, pork, peanut butter, the MMAs also include yogurt and cheese. Normally, Yogurt and cheese are included with milk in the dairy food group, but in the school meal pattern, we actually define fluid milk as its own component. So when we talk about the milk component, we are only talking about the fluid milk that you would drink. These are the components. The second term is items. Items are used to differentiate between foods within a component, but can also be used to distinguish pieces of food. For example, apples and oranges are one component because they are both fruits, but they are two different items. So we'll begin with the breakfast meal pattern as it's a bit more straightforward than lunch. You can see here that the meal pattern is broken down by grade groups. You may have noticed that breakfast requirements have a lot of overlap between the grade groups. The fluid milk and fruit component requirements are quite straightforward at breakfast. You are required to provide 1 cup of fruit and 1 cup of milk daily for a total of 5 cups weekly. Vegetables are not a required component at breakfast, but vegetables may be substituted for fruits if the first 2 cups per week are from the dark green, red-orange, legumes, or other subgroups. Starchy may be offered on any day if the weekly menu includes at least 2 cups of non-starchy vegetables. The grain requirement varies slightly by grade group at breakfast. While the daily requirement is only a 1 ounce equivalent, the weekly requirement is a range. For example, in grades K through 5, you need to provide a 2 ounce equivalent of grains on 2 out of 5 days to add up to the weekly requirement range of 7 to 10 ounce equivalents. For grades 6 through 8, you need to provide a 2 ounce equivalent on 3 out of 5 days. And for grades 9 through 12, you need to provide a 2 ounce equivalent on 4 out of 5 days to meet the minimum weekly requirements. Meat or meat alternates are not a required component at breakfast, but you may use an MMA to credit towards the grain requirement, just as long as you are offering at least a 1 ounce equivalent of grains daily. For example, a breakfast wrap with a 1 ounce grain wrap and a 1 ounce equivalent MMA egg patty counts towards 2 ounce grain equivalents in the breakfast meal pattern. The bottom half of this chart outlines the standards for calories, saturated fats, added sugars, and sodium. These numbers or ranges are daily averages based on a 5-day week. It's important to know that individual meals offered may be below or above the calorie range as long as the meals offered on average over the week remain within the calorie range for the grade group. For breakfast, you can see that there is overlap here in the standards, such that it is possible to plan a single menu that would meet the meal pattern for all 3 grade groups for breakfast. If you needed to serve grades K through 12, you could serve within the calorie range of 450 to 500 calories for average meal. Please note that this is not the case with the lunch meal pattern, which we'll get to soon. Saturated fat must account for less than 10% of the total calories of that average for the 5-day week. According to that final rule, by school year 27-28, added sugars must be less than 10% of calories across the week. Note that the first row of sodium requirements is applicable now, and the second row will be applicable starting July 1st, 2027 for the 27-28 school year. There are additional breakfast requirements around milk and juice, which falls under fruit component. Milk must be skim or 1% fat. Flavored milk must be fat-free, and milk must be offered in at least 2 different varieties every single meal. Juice can only be offered at 1 meal service a day, breakfast or lunch. Now let's discuss how to apply the meal patterns to actual meal service. There are 2 types of meal services: straight serve and offer versus serve. Straight serve is as straightforward as the name implies. You place all of the items discussed in the meal pattern on a tray in the required quantities, including milk, and you hand that complete tray to the student. In other words, the student receives every component on a pre-plated tray. The advantage of straight serve is that theoretically you know that every student has a reimbursable meal. As previously stated, this is the only allowable type of meal service for preschoolers who are not commingled with other grades. Another important point to remember about straight service is that due to the state of Rhode Island nutrition regulation, students need to be offered at least 2 or 3 different fruits and/or vegetables, depending on whether it's breakfast or lunch. So regardless of what is provided on that pre-plated tray, students still need to be given the opportunity to select more fruit or vegetables if they'd like to. Offer versus serve can be considerably more complicated, but has the advantage of allowing students to have choice, and thus has the potential to reduce plate waste. Again, as the name implies, there's a difference between what you have to offer students versus what the student actually has to take. Please note that pre-plating enough items to make the meal reimbursable and then allowing the student to decide if they want any other items is not offer versus serve. Similarly to the meal pattern, the requirements for offer versus serve differ from breakfast to lunch. When implementing offer versus serve for breakfast, you must offer at least 4 food items from 3 different food components. Components are food groups and items are the different foods within the food groups. So in order to adhere to the meal pattern, you have to offer 1 serving of milk, 1 serving of fruit, and 1 serving of grain. And then your 4th item can either be another fruit or another grain. However, the student only has to take 3 of the items you offer, one of which must be at least a half cup of fruit for their meal to be considered reimbursable. To reiterate, a student can take any 3 of the items you offer as long as one of the items is at least a half cup of fruit for the meal to be considered reimbursable. Let's practice what you've learned so far. The intention of this exercise is for you to identify whether a student approaching the POS has a reimbursable meal. So these trays may not represent everything that was offered, only what the student took or received. Does the photo represent a reimbursable breakfast tray? If you answered yes, you are correct. This is in fact a reimbursable meal. The student has at least 3 items in the appropriate serving sizes, including a half cup of fruit. Does the photo represent a reimbursable breakfast meal? If you answered no, you are correct. This is not a reimbursable meal. While all of the items on the tray are in appropriate serving sizes, there is no fruit. Is the tray pictured reimbursable or not? If you answered yes, you are correct. This is a reimbursable meal. Remember that for offer versus serve, a student only has to take 3 of the items that are offered, and as long as one of those items is at least a half a cup of fruit, the meal is reimbursable. Also remember that while the bananas are not 2 different items, they are still 2 separate items. Now, if the school were doing straight service, this would definitely not be a reimbursable meal because, as we discussed previously, with straight service, you are pre-plating the meal and you must include all of the components outlined in the meal pattern: milk, fruit, and grains. Now let's go over the lunch meal pattern. For the vegetable subgroups, this includes dark green, red-orange, legumes, starchy, and other. The lunch meal pattern is broken down by age groups just like the breakfast meal pattern. Please remember that preschool can follow the K through 5 meal pattern if they are commingled with other grades during meal service. Right away, you may have noticed that these 3 grade groups have a lot less overlap in serving sizes and calorie ranges. There is enough overlap between K through 5 and 6 through 8 meal pattern that you could plan one menu for all of those grades that would be compliant. So if we look at the calories, average calories across a 5-day week between 600 and 650 calories is enough to be compliant for grades K through 5 and 6 through 8 if you're serving both of those groups the same meals. However, there is not enough overlap with any of the other grade groups to be able to combine with grades 9 through 12. If you are menu planning for a school that includes 2 or more grade groups, like grades 6 through 8 and grades 9 through 12, you need to be careful to plan and serve the appropriate serving sizes to each grade group accordingly. So when we take a look at the vegetable subgroups mentioned earlier, there is no daily requirement for the amount of each of these vegetable subgroups that need to be offered daily. However, there are weekly requirements for each. This vegetable subgroup table includes several examples of the different vegetables in each subgroup if you need some ideas for menu planning. This is definitely worth having as a reference, especially because some items may not credit in the subgroup you'd expect them to. For example, green string beans are considered part of the other group, not dark green. This is also a good time to mention that all leafy greens, like lettuce or uncooked spinach, only credit as half of the serving size. For example, if you plan to serve a half cup of spinach for a salad, it will actually only credit as a fourth cup of greens. So you would need to plan 1 full cup to meet the half cup serving size requirement for dark green vegetables. You can find an easier to read version of this chart on our website under NSLP meal pattern requirements. So just like we had for breakfast, there are additional lunch requirements for milk and juice, and those are going to stay the same, but there is an additional requirement for fruits and vegetables at lunch, and we must offer at least 3 types of fruits and vegetables at lunchtime. Meal service types at lunch. Straight service is the same as at breakfast. You pre-plate the entire meal for each student with all 5 components listed in the meal pattern in the required quantities. This includes milk, and you hand the tray to the student. We usually see this in elementary schools. Offer versus serve for lunch is slightly different than breakfast though. You must offer all 5 components in the meal pattern, but the student has the option to decline 1 or 2 of those 5 components as long as they take at least a half cup of fruit or vegetable. This is going back to our terminology now. So instead of taking 3 items like at breakfast, students need to take at least 3 different components at lunch. So at least 3 different components, and one must be at least a half a cup of fruit or vegetable. All right, let's practice the lunch meal pattern. There are a few slides with different examples of lunch meals, and I want you to decide if you think, based on everything we've just discussed, if these meals would be reimbursable or not. Keep in mind that the intention of this exercise is for you to identify whether a student approaching the POS has a reimbursable meal, so these trays may not represent everything that was offered, only what the student took. Is this tray reimbursable or not? If you guessed yes, you are correct. This tray has all of the required components in the appropriate serving sizes to be considered a reimbursable meal. Is this meal reimbursable or not? If you answered no, you are correct. Though this student has taken 3 components, they are missing a fruit or a vegetable. Is this tray reimbursable or not? If you answered yes, you are correct. This tray has all of the required components in the appropriate serving sizes to be considered a reimbursable meal. Is this tray reimbursable or not? If you answered no, you are correct. Although this student has 3 items on their tray, lunch requires 3 different components, and this tray only has 2 because there are 2 vegetable items on this tray. Is this tray reimbursable or not? If you answered no, you are correct. This does not make a reimbursable meal. While all of the items on the tray are in the appropriate serving sizes, and there are 3 different components, there is no fruit on this tray. Is this tray reimbursable or not? If you answered yes, you are correct. Commingling is when preschool students and students from other grade groups, such as kindergarten through 5th grade, are served meals in the same place at the same time. So if pre-K is commingled, follow the K through 5 meal pattern. If pre-K is eating in a separate location or at a different meal time, they must be served the CACFP meal pattern for pre-K students. There are some notable differences between the school nutrition program meal pattern and the CACFP meal pattern for pre-K students. This slide is showing you those CACFP meal pattern requirements if pre-K students are eating alone. For fruits and vegetables at breakfast, you may serve fruits, vegetables, or a combination of both to meet the combined vegetable and fruit component requirement. At lunch, a second different vegetable may be served in place of a fruit, and there is no vegetable subgroup requirement. Grain-based desserts are not allowed at breakfast or at lunch. Enriched grains may be served at breakfast if whole grain-rich items are served at lunch, and one of the grain components during the day must be whole grain-rich. Milk. So if the students are between 3 and 5 years old, unflavored milk is the only option, and that unflavored milk can be low-fat 1% or fat-free skim. And then the sugar limits already exist. Cereals, 6 grams of added sugar or less. Yogurt, 23 grams of sugar or less per 6 ounces. And there's no deep fat frying allowed, and there's no offer versus serve allowed for this age group. You may use the family style meal service. The minimum daily requirements for preschool breakfast meal pattern for students aged 3 to 5 include 3/4 cup of milk a day, half a cup of fruit, vegetable, or both a day, half an ounce or half an ounce equivalent of grain a day. It should be said that meat or meat alternates may be served in place of the entire grain component up to 3 times per week at breakfast. There is a minimum serving size for a half an ounce equivalent of meat alternate. And then of course, again, milk must be unflavored. It has to be either low fat or fat free. The daily requirement for preschool lunch meal pattern for 3 to 5-year-olds includes 3/4 cup of fluid milk, a 1/4 cup of fruits, a 1/4 cup of vegetables. There is an option. A second different vegetable may be served in place of fruit at lunch. A half ounce of grains and 1.5 ounces of MMA. Again, the same requirements for milk apply. Smart snacks refer to any food or beverage sold outside of a reimbursable meal. The standards for smart snacks include whole grain rich grain products, or the first ingredient needs to be a fruit, a vegetable, dairy, or protein, or a combination food containing at least a 1/4 cup of fruit and or vegetable, and it must meet nutrient standards for calories, sodium, sugar, and fat. We understand that these requirements seem like a lot, but we encourage you to use the link at the bottom of the screen to the Smart Snacks calculator, which is just going to have you read the back of the label and input some information, and it'll tell you whether it meets the Smart Snack standards. Also, you can have your food service management company do this before they send you certain snacks for, let's say, a la carte items. There are additional Rhode Island requirements. There can be no artificial sweeteners, no added sweeteners in beverages, and no caffeine in any of the smart snacks sold. So here's the after-school snack program meal pattern. Students must take 2 different components in the minimum serving size. There's no requirement for a fruit or a vegetable component, and juice can only be offered twice per week per Rhode Island regulation. If you have any questions about other requirements for participating in the after-school snack program, please feel free to reach out to us. Here are some common snack combinations that meet the after-school snack requirements. So, apples and sun butter, whole grain popcorn and bananas, whole grain pretzels and 100% fruit juice, whole grain goldfish crackers and oranges, and then those in which you'd need refrigerator access. We have apples and cheese sticks, blueberries and low-fat yogurt, bell peppers with low-fat ranch, and whole grain tortilla chips, and a whole grain blueberry muffin with low-fat milk. Of course, we encourage you to use the meal pattern to build your own combinations. During an administrative review, we will request all of the nutrition-related documents to be sent for review prior to coming out on site. What we've listed up here on the screen are the documents needed to demonstrate that all meals served in schools have the required components and quantities for all grade groups being served. These apply to NSLP, SBP, and after-school snack program. As with all documents relating to an SLP, these original documents should be kept on file for 3 years plus the current year. So we're going to request menus, just making sure that the shortened non-discrimination statement is on there. Standardized recipes. We do really want specifics on the products that you're using in those recipes. For example, if you're using ground beef, are you using 80-20 ground beef? Are you using 81-19? And in what quantity did you purchase that? We're looking for production records, which sometimes aren't fully filled out, so watch out for that. We really do want to see how many meals you prepared and then how many of those items actually got taken. And then the product documentation, like CN labels and product formulation statements, are for any parts of the meal that you didn't cook from scratch. So like, let's say you're buying chicken nuggets in a great quantity. We need to see some sort of label on there, especially if they're big companies and you're getting your food from a food service management company. That company will likely have that information on deck, and if they don't, they can usually find it quite easily. So a menu is a descriptive list of all the reimbursable meals being offered. Right here we have a 5-day, Monday through Friday typical menu that we're going to see. However, for our CCIs, we are looking at a 7-day menu a lot of the time if they serve through the weekend, and that's Sunday through Saturday. Menus should list each meal being served. You want to be specific and include all fruit, vegetables, and milk options offered with each meal. You will want to demonstrate on the menu that you are in fact offering each component required daily, including all vegetable subgroups for the week. This is not only important for the SFA to have in menu planning, but it's also important for households to be able to review ahead of time in order to plan around, what the school is serving. And this will increase engagement. Do know though, if you can't explain or describe exactly what fruits and vegetables you're going to have for that week, this is why the production records need to be very detailed to make sure that we have some sort of documentation showing that you showed the right vegetables for the entire week. And at the bottom, you can see this institution is an equal opportunity provider. It is the shortened non-discrimination statement which is allowed on the menu. So production records provide documentation that the planned meals were actually served. It ensures that requirements for the meal pattern components are met in the correct quantities. And an excellent planning and forecasting tool for a successful food service operation is a good production record. So this minimizes the overproduction of food and food waste. It also identifies trends in tracking participation. It really does inform the food service staff to know, what the students are actually engaging with, what they actually like. If they're producing enough pizza, for example. The production records must show how the meals planned, were offered, and contribute to the meal pattern. So we're looking for all the food components, the food quantities, and the portion sizes of those items, and then the age group of the students being served. Demonstrate meals prepared and served. Demonstrate what was left over. Did any components run out? Show any substitutions made to the menu. Adult meals and a la carte sales should all be available on the production record. This is an example of an old production record. On the top left, you can see the date of operation and the meal period being conducted. The grade group being served is listed in the middle. On the right, we have the number of students planned and the number of students actually served that day. Looking at the items and food listed from left to right, we have the entrees and sides listed alongside the corresponding recipe number. There are daily temperatures that can be easily kept in the production record, though most of us now keep temperatures in a separate log. Serving sizes are clearly listed for each food item. And then we see how much was prepared, what was served, and what was left over. So let's say I wanted to review one of the meals listed on this record. If recipe numbers or recipe names are provided like this, I'd look for the corresponding recipe. So a lot of the times that we have findings for production records are when SFAs are getting their meals vended to them. We're still looking for that production record. So the planned amount column should come in filled out, or there should be a receipt for each menu item. The SFA is then responsible for completing the rest of the PR to document what was served. So what was actually offered reimbursable, what was offered a la carte or second meals, how many left over, etc. So let's take a look at a standardized recipe. This recipe is for a whole pizza. Now, as we review this, we can tell which ingredients are used and how much of them make one serving. Preparation instructions should be included. So now that we know what and how much goes into this meal, I would compare these ingredients to the corresponding child nutrition labels or the product formulation statements in order to determine how much MMA and how many grain equivalents one slice credits for. In food production, you will want to make sure that you are accurately measuring or weighing the ingredients. For example, the cheese that is added to the pizza should be the 1 pound amount to ensure that the 2 ounces per slice is made to an equal 2 ounces MMA for every slice taken by every student. So, ounce equivalents are used to determine the creditable amount of grain or MMA in a given product. For example, a nutrition facts label on a package of bread might state that one slice of bread weighs 2 ounces, but that does not guarantee that one slice of bread is a 2-ounce equivalent of grain. Bread is made with other ingredients besides the grain. And so it is likely that one slice of bread that weighs 2 ounces may only be 1.5 ounces or even 1 ounce equivalent of grain. Check the whole grain content on the product ingredient label or use the manufacturer's product documentation to see which ingredient comes first. For something to be whole grain rich, we want the first ingredient to be whole grain flour. Similarly, MMA products like lunch meat, for example, often contain a lot of water and filler. By checking the manufacturer's child nutrition documentation, you can be sure that you have an accurate ounce equivalent measure for your product. It doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be using that product if it's not high in MMA, but you want to be making sure that you're using enough of it to make those requirements. So when we can't credit a food for how much grain or MMA it has simply by measuring it out, we're looking for child nutrition labels or product formulation statements. And we use this to validate the ounce equivalent in a product. So an example could be chicken nuggets, sausage, even deli meats. Again, you can't simply measure that product to determine how much it contributes to the meal pattern because it's not 100% MMA, right? Like there's filler, there's water, sometimes there's grain, etc. So fortunately, many of these items can be found with a CN label or product formulation statement that states exactly how a serving will credit under the meal pattern, just because they're offered in school systems like around the country, that these companies already produce these product formulation statements or CN labels that go directly on the box. It's not a requirement for all food companies to provide these documents, so it really is the responsibility of the SFA to find products that have these documents available. The USDA Child Nutrition Labeling Program provides food manufacturers the option to include a standardized food crediting statement on their product label. CN labels are great because it neatly packages the crediting information for food products right on that label. So this is an example of a CN label that clearly identifies the contribution of a product towards meal pattern requirements. A CN label usually looks just like this. There's the CN logo, a distinct border, the meal pattern contribution statement, a 6-digit product identification number in the top right-hand corner, USDA or FNS authorization statement, usually at the end of the CN label statement, and then the month and year of approval. Here is a CN label represented on Tyson chicken drumsticks. As you can see, they tend to be small on the actual labels, so you want to keep your eye out for that CN border. To document these, ideally you want to remove or photocopy this from the actual box if you receive it, and keep it for your records. If you are taking a picture or photocopying it, make sure it's clear and legible, and then save that. I encourage you to do that instead. If you do not have the original CN label, you may use a copy of the CN label with a watermark displaying the product name and CN label provided by the vendor, and that's only if you can also provide the bill of lading or the invoice containing the product name. So now on to the product formulation statement. This document may be 1 or 2 pages long, and it should have the product's company letterhead on the top. You'll find the product name, the code number, the portion size. You'll see the calculation within the body of the letter, followed by the crediting amount for the portion size. Crediting is always rounded down to the nearest quarter ounce, and of course the crediting total cannot exceed the actual serving size of the product. For example, a 2.15 ounce beef patty can't credit over a 2 ounce MMA equivalent. An official of the manufacturer and not a salesperson should certify all statements made in the document with their signature. So here's Land O'Lakes product formulation statement for their shredded mozzarella cheese. You can see that the company letterhead is at the top of the document. Here's the product information, including that code, the product name, the portion size, and weight that you can purchase that product in. The product is being credited for 1 ounce MMA. So here we have the calculation used, and we see that the manufacturer did a good job of making sure that the product formulation statement is signed and dated at the bottom. To determine if a product has a product formulation statement, contact the manufacturer directly. The product packaging will contain the telephone number or mailing address. Explain that you need the child nutrition information for their product. They may ask for the UPC number, so have this information available as well. Again, if you have a food service management company, the implication is that they're doing this for you, and this is a good best practice for food service management companies, just to have the appropriate documentation for all of the ingredients and products that they're using. Other ways to determine menu compliance for specific ingredients are like by using the USDA's food buying guide tool, in which you can input ingredients and you'll get servings per unit purchased, and be able to determine the appropriate amount of, let's say, MMA in a product, for example. Like we mentioned earlier, ground beef, for example, ground beef with more fat in it is going to provide you like a lower amount of MMA. So this is really good for specific ingredients like that as purchased. Another tool that we use and we have available on our website is a grain requirements chart that can be very helpful for ounce equivalents. So when you are being reviewed by us, we collect what are called menu worksheets, spreadsheets that have the meal pattern calculator in it. And if you're starting a new program, or if you have some new foods that you want to introduce, always reach out to us, because we can show you this, and it's a great tool for knowing whether these meals are compliant or not. These are some of the resources that we went through today. As always, we encourage you to take a look at our website for more. Thank you so much for listening to the meal pattern and nutrition documentation training. If you do have any questions, please use the following slide to reach out to any of us at RIDE. Thank you.